David Miller was born in the quiet suburbs of Los Angeles, where dreams of innocence were painted against the backdrop of a city bursting with ambition. But dreams can shatter just as easily as glass. One fateful night, the warmth of his childhood home was pierced by the sound of violence, a robbery gone wrong. He was just a boy then, hiding under the kitchen table, his heart pounding so loud he thought the intruders might hear it. When he dared to peek out, his father was on the floor, his glasses cracked, his hands trembling as he clutched his wife close. The intruder stood over them, his face a mask of indifference, his gun a cruel symbol of power. For David, that moment was more than fear, it was a revelation. He learned then that the world was not safe, that evil was not an abstract idea but a force capable of invading even the most sacred of spaces. Years later, when people asked why he became a cop, David would deflect with a polite smile, but deep down, he knew the truth. That night had planted a fire in his soul, one that burned with a singular purpose: to stand between the innocent and the darkness. It was not just a job, it was a calling, a mission to reclaim the sense of security that had been stolen from him. David wasn't looking for love when he met Emily Carter. At 32, he was married to his badge, his days filled with the grind of patrols and the cold calculation of crime scenes. It was at a mutual friend's barbecue, the kind of event where laughter feels forced and the beer is always lukewarm. Then she walked in. Emily wasn't the loudest or the flashiest, but there was something magnetic about her, a quiet confidence that turned heads without demanding attention. She was an agent at the nearby penitentiary, and though her job carried its own weight, she spoke about it with a lightness that intrigued him. They found themselves talking under the orange glow of string lights, their laughter carrying into the night. David was drawn to her sharp wit, the way she saw the world not in absolutes but in layers of complexity. By the time the evening ended, he couldn't shake the feeling that meeting her was the start of something extraordinary. What he didn't know was that their story would be anything but simple. The Miller family was the kind that wrapped you in a warm embrace and made you feel like you belonged, even if you were a stranger. Susan and Robert, David's parents, had spent decades building a life defined by love, honesty, and quiet resilience. Their home was a sanctuary, filled with the smell of freshly baked bread and the sound of old jazz records crackling on the stereo. Emily fit into their world with surprising ease. At Sunday dinners, she'd sit beside David, her laughter blending seamlessly with the family's familiar rhythm. Jennifer, David's sister, often teased him, but she too found herself charmed by Emily's down-to-earth demeanor. And Mark, Jennifer's husband, appreciated her sharp insights into the justice system, their discussions often stretching late into the evening. David watched it all with a swelling sense of pride. For years, his family had been his anchor, his refuge. Seeing them embrace Emily with open arms only deepened his certainty that she was the one. In those moments, he allowed himself to dream of a future where the life he'd built could merge with hers, creating something even greater than he'd imagined. Mark was a man who believed in the rule of law, in the clarity of right and wrong. As an attorney, he had built a reputation on his meticulous preparation and unwavering integrity. But even the most upright lives can be tested. It started with a file left on his desk, innocuous at first glance. But as he read further, the details grew darker: falsified accounts, forged signatures, transactions that reeked of corruption. The file implicated some of the most powerful partners in his firm. Mark was faced with an impossible choice: speak out and risk everything he'd worked for, or stay silent and compromise the values that defined him. Jennifer noticed the change in him. He became quieter, more withdrawn, his eyes heavy with a burden he couldn't share. He told himself he was protecting her, protecting their future. But as the days passed, the weight of his silence began to crack the foundation of their marriage. Mark had always been the man with answers, but now, he found himself trapped in a maze of uncertainty. Across town, in the dimly lit corridors of the LAPD, Detective Thomas Jackson pored over a murder case that refused to give up its secrets. The victim was a low-level dealer, his body found in an alley littered with graffiti and broken dreams. But this wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a message. Jackson was known for his unorthodox methods, the kind that got results but left a trail of bureaucratic headaches. He followed the breadcrumbs of evidence to Michael King, a name that struck fear even in the most hardened officers. King wasn't just a criminal, he was a puppeteer, his strings reaching deep into the underbelly of Los Angeles. As Jackson closed in, he found himself drawn into a game of psychological warfare. King was a master manipulator, even behind bars, his influence seeping into every crack of the justice system. For Jackson, this wasn't just about solving a murder, it was about dismantling a network of power that thrived on fear and corruption. When King was finally arrested, it felt less like a victory and more like the opening move of a larger, more dangerous game. His demeanor in the interrogation room was chillingly calm, a man who knew his power extended far beyond the bars of his cell. He spoke in riddles, taunting the detectives with half-truths and veiled threats. Jackson knew better than to underestimate him. Even in custody, King had a way of making the walls feel porous, his reach extending to guards, inmates, and anyone desperate enough to fall under his sway. The case wasn't just about bringing King to justice, it was about surviving the storm that followed in his wake. The proposal was everything David had imagined and more. On a patch of land overlooking the city, where their dream house would one day stand, he knelt before Emily. His words were simple but heavy with meaning. For a moment, time stood still. Emily's tears glistened in the fading sunlight as she said yes, her voice trembling with joy. They talked late into the night about their future, the life they would build together. It was a moment David would replay in his mind for weeks to come, unaware that the foundation of their dreams was already cracking beneath the surface. It began with small changes, almost imperceptible at first. Emily, once open and steady, grew distant. Her laughter, once warm and genuine, became hollow, as though rehearsed. David noticed it, of course, but he chalked it up to the pressures of her work. After all, her job in the penitentiary was no easy task, surrounded daily by the weight of broken lives. Perhaps it was natural for her to retreat now and then. But this was something different. Her wardrobe shifted, her style evolving into something bold, almost defiant. Her evenings, once spent with David or his family, became solitary ventures. She started visiting bars he'd never heard of, places that reeked of trouble. It was as if she were trying to shed her old self, to step into a role he couldn't recognize. And yet, he said nothing. Love, he told himself, required patience. But beneath his quiet understanding lay the simmering unease of a man who knew he was losing someone he couldn't bear to let go. Jennifer Miller had always been the optimist of the family, the one who believed that every storm could be weathered with enough resolve. But no amount of resolve could change the fact that she and Mark were struggling to conceive. Each negative test felt like a betrayal, not just of her body, but of the dream she and Mark had nurtured together. Mark, ever the pragmatist, suggested they take a step back, perhaps consider other options. But for Jennifer, this wasn't about options, it was about hope. Hope that if they tried hard enough, if they followed every doctor's advice, they could still have the family they had envisioned. The treatments were grueling, both physically and emotionally. Jennifer found herself withdrawing, her usual warmth dimmed by the weight of her disappointment. Mark, too, was changing. The stress of supporting her while grappling with his own feelings of helplessness began to erode the easy intimacy they once shared. Their marriage, once a source of joy, became a silent battleground where love and frustration waged a quiet war. Detective Jackson's work often felt like piecing together a puzzle where half the pieces were deliberately hidden. The King case was no exception. Every lead seemed to dissolve into nothing, every witness too terrified to speak. It was only through sheer persistence that he stumbled upon the letters, cryptic messages passed from King's cell to a woman named Sarah Jones. The letters spoke in riddles, codes that hinted at something larger, a network that stretched far beyond the prison walls. Sarah Jones, Jackson discovered, wasn't just an accomplice, she was King's lifeline to the outside world. She wasn't transporting drugs or weapons, she was carrying secrets, whispers of plans that could unravel everything Jackson had worked for. As he read the letters, one thing became clear: Sarah wasn't just a pawn. She was complicit, willingly stepping into a role that made her both valuable and dangerous. Jackson knew he had to find her, not just to break King's hold, but to understand the woman who had willingly tethered herself to a man like him. When Jackson finally confronted Sarah Jones, he expected defiance. Instead, he found fear. Beneath her confident facade lay a young woman who had been seduced by promises she didn't fully understand. She wasn't the hardened criminal he had imagined, she was desperate, manipulated, and utterly trapped. Using every ounce of his skill, Jackson began to dismantle the walls she had built around herself. He spoke of consequences, of the lives that could be destroyed if she continued down this path. Slowly, she began to open up, her words revealing a network of lies and threats that stretched back to King. Jackson convinced her to become an informant, a role that placed her in unimaginable danger. But even as she agreed, there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Whether it was fear of King's wrath or guilt for her complicity, Jackson couldn't tell. What he did know was that Sarah's cooperation was a gamble, one that could either bring down a criminal empire or shatter everything they were trying to protect. Sarah Jones was a fiction, a mask carefully constructed by Emily Carter. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, unraveling everything Jackson thought he knew. Through flashbacks, the truth emerged: Emily's tragic past, the accident that had robbed her of her parents, and the years spent bouncing between foster homes that offered no comfort, no stability. King had found her in her most vulnerable state, a young woman desperate for connection and purpose. He gave her both, though at a cost she couldn't fully comprehend. He became a mentor, a lover, and a puppeteer, pulling strings that led her deeper into his world. The letters between them weren't just about logistics, they were love letters, filled with obsession and admiration. Emily saw King as a symbol of power, a man who had taken control of a world that had once controlled him. But her feelings were tangled, complicated by guilt and a lingering sense of right and wrong. Every choice she made brought her closer to King's darkness and further from the light she had once shared with David. David had always trusted his instincts, but love had blinded him to the signs he couldn't ignore any longer. When he followed Emily to that bar, it was with a sinking feeling he couldn't shake. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. She wasn't just distant, she was someone else entirely. Watching her interact with one of King's men was a betrayal that hit harder than any physical blow. David's world crumbled as he realized the woman he had planned to marry wasn't the Emily he thought he knew. Fury and heartbreak warred within him as he confronted her, demanding answers he wasn't prepared to hear. The confrontation was explosive, a moment that laid bare the lies and the secrets she had kept hidden. But it wasn't until Detective Jackson intervened that the full scope of the truth emerged. Emily wasn't just betraying him, she was working with the very man David had sworn to bring down. It was a revelation that left him gutted, torn between love and duty, trust and betrayal. In the aftermath, David retreated into silence, his thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. He couldn't reconcile the woman he loved with the person she had become. Yet, even as his anger simmered, he couldn't let go of the memories of the life they had dreamed of together. Emily, for her part, was caught in her own web of lies. Her feelings for King were real, but so was her guilt. She had tried to walk the line between loyalty and morality, but now that line had blurred beyond recognition. She knew her actions had consequences, but she wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. David Miller was a man defined by strength, by resilience, but even steel bends under enough pressure. Emily's betrayal struck at the core of his being, unraveling the foundation upon which he had built his life. He had always believed in the clarity of right and wrong, in the sanctity of love and family. But now, those beliefs felt like fragile illusions, shattered by the woman who had promised to stand beside him. In the weeks that followed, David withdrew from the world. His badge, once a symbol of his purpose, felt heavy on his chest. The precinct buzzed with rumors, whispers that he couldn't escape. His colleagues pitied him, but their sympathy felt like salt on an open wound. It was his family who stood by him, offering a quiet, unwavering support that he couldn't bring himself to accept fully. Susan, his mother, sat with him for hours, her presence a reminder of the unconditional love that had always anchored him. Robert, his father, shared stories of his own struggles, moments of vulnerability that David had never known existed. And Jennifer, despite her own challenges, reminded him that even in the darkest moments, there was always a sliver of light. But for David, the path forward was anything but clear. How do you rebuild a life when the person you trusted most has become a stranger? How do you forgive, or even begin to understand, the choices that led to your heartbreak? Mark had spent weeks wrestling with his own demons, the weight of the corruption he had uncovered threatening to crush him. He had always believed in the law, in the power of truth to prevail. But exposing the fraud within his firm meant risking everything: his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his safety. Jennifer's struggles only deepened his turmoil. How could he ask her to endure more, to shoulder the burden of his moral crusade when she was already fighting her own battles? And yet, Mark knew that silence was not an option. The truth demanded to be told, no matter the cost. When he finally made the decision to come forward, it was with a mix of fear and resolve. The fallout was swift and brutal. He lost his job, faced veiled threats from powerful men, and saw his once bright future reduced to uncertainty. But through it all, he held on to one thing: the knowledge that he had done the right thing. For David, Mark's courage became a beacon. In his brother-in-law's sacrifice, he saw a reflection of his own struggle, a reminder that integrity, even in the face of devastating consequences, was worth fighting for. Detective Jackson had always been a man who thrived on control, on the precision of a well-executed plan. But with King and Emily, control was an illusion. The deeper he dug, the more tangled the web became. It wasn't just about drugs or weapons anymore. This was about power, the kind that corrupted everything it touched. Through intercepted messages and reluctant informants, Jackson and David uncovered a chilling plot. King, even from behind bars, was orchestrating an audacious escape plan. It wasn't just about his freedom, it was about silencing the witnesses who could bring him down. The plan was intricate, ruthless, and terrifyingly effective. Emily's role in the scheme was undeniable. She wasn't just complicit, she was pivotal. And yet, her actions seemed to defy easy categorization. Was she a willing participant, or was she playing a dangerous game of her own? For David, the question was more than academic. It was a matter of life and death, of understanding whether the woman he loved was beyond redemption. In the heat of the plot's climax, Emily made her choice. Standing at the crossroads of loyalty and morality, she turned against King, protecting the very witness he had marked for death. Her actions were swift, calculated, and ultimately, damning. She confessed everything, her role in King's plans, the lies she had told, and the lines she had crossed. But her confession was not an absolution. It was a reckoning, a moment of clarity in which she faced the consequences of her actions. She claimed that her betrayal of King had been part of a larger plan, a desperate attempt to gather the evidence needed to bring him down. But the truth was murky, her motives tangled in a web of love, guilt, and fear. For David, Emily's actions were both a relief and a torment. She had saved lives, yes, but at what cost? Her redemption came too late to undo the damage she had caused, too late to restore the trust she had shattered. And yet, in her eyes, he saw the faintest glimmer of the woman he had once loved, a woman who had lost her way but was fighting to find it again. The showdown with King was inevitable. In a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of the city, David and Jackson faced the man who had orchestrated so much pain and chaos. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. King was defiant until the end, his arrogance undiminished even as his empire crumbled around him. The firefight that ensued was brutal and chaotic, a clash of wills that left no room for hesitation. In the end, King's reign of terror was brought to a violent conclusion, his arrest marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For David, the confrontation was cathartic, a moment of closure that allowed him to reclaim some semblance of control. But it was also a stark reminder of the cost of justice, the lives lost, the trust broken, and the scars that would never fully heal. In the courtroom, Emily faced her reckoning. She stood before the judge, her voice steady but laden with regret. She took full responsibility for her actions, refusing to deflect blame or seek sympathy. Her testimony was a mosaic of confession and reflection, a portrait of a woman who had been both victim and perpetrator. She spoke of her love for David, her admiration for King, and the choices that had led her down a path she could no longer justify. The jury's verdict was swift and decisive. Emily was sentenced to prison, her fate a stark contrast to the life she had once envisioned. But in her punishment, there was also a sense of closure, a chance for her to atone, to rebuild, and perhaps, one day, to forgive herself. David's visit to the prison was not about closure. It was about understanding. He needed to see her, to hear her voice, to confront the woman who had been both his greatest love and his deepest betrayal. Their conversation was raw and unfiltered, a collision of pain, anger, and lingering affection. Emily apologized, her words sincere but insufficient. David listened, his silence more eloquent than any response. He told her he had loved her, that a part of him always would. But that love was no longer enough to bridge the chasm between them. As he walked away, David felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of their shared past no longer pressed so heavily on his shoulders. He could move forward, not unscarred, but unburdened. Amid the chaos, there was a glimmer of hope. Jennifer and Mark, having endured so much, chose to adopt a child, a refugee from Ukraine whose smile spoke of resilience and renewal. In their decision, they found a new purpose, a new chapter that reminded them of the boundless capacity of love. David found solace in service, dedicating himself to helping other officers navigate the moral complexities of their profession. His story became a testament to the power of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal and loss, there was always a way forward. As he stood before a room of young recruits, he spoke not as a man defined by his scars, but as someone who had learned to live with them. Justice, he told them, isn't about perfection. It's about the courage to keep fighting, even when the odds are against you. And with those words, David Miller began again.